Good morning. I'm Erin Lamb, a member of this year's Program Planning Committee, and it is my great pleasure to introduce today's plenary panel. You'll surely note that this plenary includes a few extra panelists compared to our norm. This reflects our attempt to include as many perspectives as we could fit in one plenary in recognition of the myriad ways the humanities intersects with bioethics. The panel members represent diverse approaches to health humanities, including, but not limited to, arts, literature, philosophy, theology, and history. The panel moderator, Joe Ryan, will ask each panelist to define their perspective on what we as ASBH mean by bioethics and humanities. How should we conceptualize the humanities' relationship with bioethics, both in our present moment and moving forward? We'll hear from each of the panelists, and then we'll have some time at the end of the session for audience questions. Now I'll hand things over to Joe Ryan, our moderator, to start the discussion.
Hello, I'm Johanna Ryan, Program Director of the Mayo Clinic Dolores Jean Lavin Center for Humanities and Medicine. Welcome to this plenary panel, What About the H in ASBH? Exploring the intersections across bioethics and humanities. This plenary presentation considers points of intersection among bioethics and humanities and asks big questions that are grounded in a discussion that's been alive for at least 6 decades, as it was addressed in the iconic and problematic construction of C.P. Snow in his 1959 Cambridge Address. For some, in contemporary discussion, practitioners of bioethics would seem to take the role, to borrow from the terms of Snow's dichotomous relationship, of natural scientists, and practitioners of health humanities appear to take the role of literary intellectuals or occasionally artists. For those of us who are members and regular attendees of the convenings of ASBH, the question seems to recur. What exactly do we mean when we speak of the American Society of Bioethics and humanities? When we consider the work performed under each umbrella, how do we perceive and understand not only its content, but its purpose and nature? What exactly is the health and/or medical humanities? And are they really humanities with a capital H or something else entirely? And most importantly, what are these two very different animals doing in the same kennel? Do they share any behavior or characteristics? Are they capable of sharing food? Can they communicate with one another? Is it possible that they might be able to come together to serve a shared purpose in the realm of healthcare delivery and medical education? Our panelists are thought leaders working in a range of academic disciplines, including theology, philosophy, literary studies, narrative medicine, theater and performance studies, disability studies, bioethics, health humanities, and medical education. Each panelist will introduce themselves and offer insightful, perceptive, and evocative comments addressing these questions. Following this recorded session, we'll look forward to a robust question and answer session in the live conference immediately following this recording. Thanks.
Hello. I'm Gretchen Case from the University of Utah School of Medicine. This is Stealth Humanities. If you have not trained in the medical professions, you are not going to enter the operating theater as anything other than a patient or an observer. But let's not minimize those important roles. If you have trained primarily in the arts and humanities, you are deeply valuable as an observer, as a namer of narratives, as a provider of counter-narratives, as a reminder that medicine belongs to all of us, perhaps especially, primarily, to the patients. Healthcare is a performance. The operating theater is only the most obvious clue. That doesn't mean it's not real. Remember that to perform comes from the root to do, to accomplish, and a great performance requires more than a recitation of a script. A great performance requires multiple perspectives and is never a solo accomplishment, even when it is a one-person show, like the one you're about to witness. Welcome. When you arrive at medical school, they don't tell you what's about to happen. They do try to tell the students arriving at medical school, you'll feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, and half of what we teach you now will be obsolete in 10 years. We just don't know which half. They spend a great deal of time preparing and supporting students for the challenges of medical education and training. They know how strange and stressful it is to enter this world with its own rules and languages, not at all like joining a military or a priesthood, but not so different either. They want students to make it through, to succeed, to become better doctors, but they don't tell you anything. It dawns on you at some point that you are them. That's why they didn't tell you. You're supposed to already know. A pause, a beat or two, a moment of direct address to the audience to explain. I am a doctor, but not a physician. I teach in a medical school, although I've taught in many other settings. I teach arts and humanities, but answer to she teaches ethics, at least long enough to get a conversation going about the differences. I'm here to talk about what it means to hold space for arts and humanities in what appears to be a science-driven world. I'm here to talk about what it really means to do interdisciplinary work. That's enough exposition for now. Back to the scene. You are drinking from a fire hose. You couldn't possibly determine what's obsolete and what's not because you don't understand what anything means. You speak and it's very, very wrong. You are chastised, then welcomed back, then punished, then praised. You write about drowning and you're not sure that it's metaphorical. But you stay and you observe and you analyze because that's what you know how to do. You know how to look up words and write down patterns. You note costumes and props. Don't say that, it angers them. You note scripts being followed without question or interpretation. Don't take their scripts if you don't have something else to offer. You see unending performances without time for rehearsals. Don't point this out yet. But then you begin to find spaces, moments that haven't been built, connections that haven't been made. You start to speak with them about these spaces. You are still them. Fourth wall down. I'm going to disappoint on a number of levels today. I will not have a firm grasp on all of the extraordinary literature available on the arts and humanities as they relate to health and healthcare. I will not be able to speak to every permutation of interdisciplinary work. I will not definitively settle any arguments about who should teach arts and humanities in health or a healthcare context. I will not quote Foucault. I will not be able to take myself out of this talk. Fourth wall up. Your program is called Medical Humanities, but the trend is moving towards Health Humanities. You joke that what you do is Stealth Humanities, and you giggle every time at your clever wordplay, but it's also true. You are stealthy. You rarely name what you do ahead of time, you just do it and name it later. Almost 10 years after arriving, they are still asking, where did you train? How did you know that? Even when you list the items on your vita, history, performance studies, communication studies, cultural studies, X number of degrees, X number of postdocs, X number of institutions, any curiosity or concerns are satisfied quickly, and the conversation returns to the work at hand. You realize you love the practicality of the work at hand. There's always so much work. You offer content, but also look for ways to shape delivery. You learn not just what they teach, but how they teach it, and you move from only observing to partnering, to performing. You recite the holy trinity of academics to yourself, research, teaching, service, and start to understand that service is far more important than you were told in grad school. Service on multiple committees helps you understand how and where your work matters, which allows you to teach, which allows you to conduct research on how arts and humanities and health and healthcare and medical education all come together in surprising ways. You need to read more, write more. There's always so much work. A quick aside for those still with me. If I had a nickel for every time someone insisted that I just say something, anything, stop asking the questions and dance around the conclusions, I'd have a bunch of nickels. We're moving into the final act here where I further frustrate anyone set on disciplinary rigor and or clear instructions on doing interdisciplinary work, especially when it involves healthcare or health education. Ready? Stealth humanities means compromise and imperfection. It means that you are not going to be able to hold tightly to your disciplinary boundaries and precepts at all times, that you will have to choose which ones matter in the moment, to think on your feet, to improvise. It means service, but never serving. You find the places where you are an equal partner and you refuse the so-called opportunities in which you are only a supporting player. It will take a while for you to figure out which are which. It means listening more than talking in sum total, but actually you talk to everyone all the time. Never turn down a chance to hear what someone has to say about what they do or think or hope. It means telling students that there are more questions than answers, that uncertainty is not failure, that anyone who claims complete mastery of anything is deceiving themselves. It means trying to believe that yourself. Stealth humanities means returning to the only goal shared by everyone there: humans giving the best and most appropriate care to humans. Which means taking apart every word in that sentence and returning to very basic but elided truths like healthcare professionals are humans who need care. Patients step in and out of the patient role. Care is not simple to explain, nor is it something anyone can live without. Stealth is an asset. You move efficiently and effectively, announce yourself purposefully, retreat to observe strategically. You are insider outsider, them and not them. You can get lost. In the theater, spikes are placed on the stage using glow tape to guide the performers into position. In the quiet and the dark before anything begins, you move yourself into place. You are there when the lights come up, not to fix them or fight them or fawn over them. You are a part of this show. Thank you.
My name is Patrick Smith, and I teach at Duke University Divinity School. Often when one thinks about bioethics, they assume the medical application of bioethics, big questions around emerging technologies in healthcare. While these medical and technological advances are important, they often fail to acknowledge or highlight questions of social justice or human well-being. The humanities remind us that not all of these problems are resolved by a technological fix. They can help us reframe and reimagine the way we see and experience the world. Historically, healthcare has been associated with religious communities and shaped by some of the values that emerge from these traditions. Many people who interface with the scientific medical community have been influenced by a number of these traditions and the mixed set of values embraced within them. This is not to contend that these values are only rooted within theological communities, of course. It is to say, however, that there is a historical relationship nonetheless that needs to be mined for its possible contributions for those involved with bioethics. How might the work of bioethics benefit from the presence of theology or the insights from various religious philosophies? Well, following Anna Marie Vigan, I want to highlight just 4 benefits. First, something rich may be lost in our discourse and practice when the wisdom of particular peoples and traditions is rendered categorically obsolete or inappropriate. Second, as science advances, our society does not advance beyond basic questions of what it means to live fully and in right relations with others. Theology perhaps can offer a language and some resources for ongoing reevaluation of these kinds of questions and matters. Third, theology of various sorts can expand the conceptual frameworks of bioethics and the scope of what is considered as part of bioethics. It can provide a more robust description of freedom, accounts of embodiment, the nature of solidarity, justice, and so on. Theology reminds us that every ethos has a mythos. And last, the presence of theology can help us identify issues of ultimate concerns or, well, maybe penultimate concerns. Those things that matter most to enough of us fundamentally shape our societies and moral commitments. I want to reflect just a bit on this last point. For me, those expressions of theology that focus on the least of these and those on the margins, those questions of social justice, I think, are important to the work of bioethics. I am persuaded of this because they tend to touch on matters of penultimate concern. My research in health and healthcare disparities, for example, examines the distinctions affecting people based on race and socioeconomic status. It is sobering when we think about the alarming statistics around the claim that a significant indicator of health outcomes is based on zip codes. Among these outcomes are increased incidence of infant mortality, insufficient reproductive health care, higher rates of diabetes, hypertension and heart disease, and even disparities around the way people die. Questions of social justice are also critical in the world of biomedical ethics. The fact that bioethics brings together so many disciplines makes answering ethical questions both exhilarating and challenging at the same time. In the age of being able to manipulate our own genetic structure, creating physical and psychological changes in our own bodies and in shaping the next generation through emerging biomedical technologies, we must remain engaged in fundamental philosophical and theological questions around what it means to be human and what kind of people we collectively aim to be. With new medical and technological advances comes a renewed interest in the desire to select particular human traits, which can be a serious detriment to social justice, perhaps. Are these benign, morally neutral choices? Or are we seeking to avoid those characteristics in others that we deem inferior or flawed? What judgments are we making about people who are living with those kinds of characteristics we choose against, particularly when they are racialized? Social justice is also important to the work of bioethics when considering factors of environmental ethics. Through my experience as an advocate for affordable housing, I know firsthand it is hard to separate health and health outcomes from the larger environment or biosphere in the places where people live and interact. Large amounts of waste and pollutants are often placed in areas where people are already politically disenfranchised and disempowered. Additionally, the most detrimental impact felt most quickly from the climate crisis is often in areas having high populations of people of color and those who are economically disenfranchised. These communities are less likely to receive adequate protection to prevent disasters. Also, they are less likely to receive immediate responses when emergencies occur. Understanding the impact the environment can have on health and health outcomes puts environmental ethics squarely in this conversation. I think our current moment of dealing with COVID-19 is yet another reminder as to why questions of social justice and how the humanities contribute to thinking about these issues is important to the work of bioethics. Pandemics like COVID-19 signify challenges to health and human well-being, both in our physical bodies as well as in our body politic. In other words, they display the effects of an underlying socio-political pathology just as much as diseases like COVID-19 present pathologically in people's bodies. Ethics dealing with these issues then must attend to both of these categories simultaneously while recognizing that each one is multifaceted and each one requires different sets of resources to address. If these are issues and concerns that are bioethical, then we must work to better conceptualize the intersections of bioethics with the humanities. The future of bioethics must lean in conversations where theology, philosophy, political science, sociology, the arts, and ethics can help us think about disparities in health and human well-being. Therefore, we must answer questions of racism and class and other social determinants of health, and not just as an afterthought, but as an emphasis. The humanities, I am convinced, can help us with this. I look forward to the discussion and question and answer. Thank you.
I'm Rebecca Garden. I'm an associate professor of public health and preventive medicine at SUNY Upstate Medical University, and I'm a literature PhD who became a health humanities scholar and educator when I was a grad student in the English department at Columbia University. I answered a job ad and began working in the program in narrative medicine at Columbia University's medical school and became managing editor of the journal Literature and Medicine. This is how I became immersed in a field that engages critically with literature, film, visual art, performance, and stories collected through interviews, a whole range of cultural objects and productions, as a means of centering the experiences of those who are ill and analyzing healthcare and public health. It was a serendipitous discovery for me, as I was already independently practicing that kind of cultural and critical work as a non-clinician, writing a dissertation on women and illness in 18th century transatlantic Anglo culture. Through my dissertation research, the experience of reading and writing my way into and through ideas about fiction, criticism, theory, and history, I was also working through some profoundly disorienting experiences of loss and trauma. In a short period of time, I lost loved ones to cancer, alcoholism, AIDS, and suicide. And the effects of those losses resulted in fairly constant and severe anxiety. I found not only solace, but also clarity about the social as well as individual dimensions of these diseases by losing myself in the histories, the artifices, and the theories of fiction. I was absorbed into novels that explored the relationship between contagious diseases and infectious narratives, such as Charles Brockden Brown's novel Arthur Mervyn, which was published in 1799, and which tells the story of the yellow fever epidemic that decimated Philadelphia in 1793. This kind of literature demonstrates the entwined nature of bodies, imagination, and culture. When a crowd in the countryside gather around someone who's just arrived from Philadelphia, his story of the wildly spreading fever triggers its own disease. Brown writes, "The hero grew pale, his breath was stifled by inquietudes, his blood was chilled. Some were haunted by a melancholy bordering upon madness, and some, in consequence of sleepless panics for which no cause could be assigned and for which no opiates could be found, were attacked by lingering or mortal diseases." The listeners, and maybe also the novel readers, are infected and materially affected by the narrative. At the time, the philosopher Adam Smith said that through the imagination, we can, quote, place ourselves in the sufferer's situation. We conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into his body. I was fascinated by the way that literature and art could get inside my body as well as my mind and make me sick, or help me to identify the mechanisms and ethics of social bonds and of care. I studied the way that another 18th century author, Fanny Burney, used medical discourses of smallpox inoculation to argue that novel reading and novel writing are a kind of inoculation in themselves. By taking in small doses of experience, the author and the reader may survive the plague. When I became a professor of bioethics and humanities and a bioethics educator, I saw how much health humanities is needed to better represent those who experience illness and disability and who devise their own cultural practices of healing. The need to further explore the interconnectedness of illness, disease, medicine, and social and power relations led me to disability studies. Within the field of disability studies is an extensive body of creative and academic work that analyzes medical discourse and authority, identifying the ways that disability is pathologized and medicalized, and how medical discourses can individualize and naturalize the structural inequalities that shape illness and impairment. Disability studies as a field integrates the humanities and social sciences and focuses on justice, rights, politics, social and power relations, and on collective action. I learned from disability studies not only to scope into a granular focus on individual experiences and identity, but also to scale out, to analyze the structural and systemic factors that shape health, disability, illness, and also healthcare and public health. This was a needed corrective to health humanities' emphasis on individual experience, due in part to the focus on narrative. Disability studies' foundation in embodiment, the interconnection of the social and the material, frames a discipline that has always been political, publicly engaged, and focused on revealing structural inequalities. Increasingly, health humanities scholarship and pedagogy draw on history, politics, economics, and the social sciences to scale out to address the ideologies and social and political practices that are literally incorporated and materialized as disability and disease. This approach and the emphasis on the expertise and knowledge in disabled and ill people can guide bioethics to focus more on the structural inequalities outside the clinic. It can also enable bioethicists to experience imaginatively the healing being done through cultural work, such as writing, art, and storytelling as activism. By exploring these modes of cultural healing and scaling out to structures, as well as scoping in to interpersonal experiences and identity, we can work to confront structural ableism and structural inequalities like systemic racism through social change and political transformation. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Keisha Ray. I'm an assistant professor at McGovern Medical School at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. As many of you may recall, when you are a junior bioethicist like myself, you often get a lot of unsolicited advice from more senior bioethicists. One piece of advice that I have received beginning as far back as my grad school days and as recently as just a few months ago is to make my work distinctly bioethics. From what I gather from this advice, and I've thought a lot about it, is that I should make sure that my research projects follow the principles and the methodologies of bioethics, that my work should not be confused with any other discipline. Similarly, I get told to make sure that my tenure file is solidly bioethics, which again, I take to mean I should publish in bioethics journals. Of course, the better they are, the better for my tenure file, get research grants from top health and scientific organizations, participate in bioethics, scientific, medical research, and teach bioethics courses at my medical school. I've received this advice during ASBH conferences from attendees who are chairs of their department, mentors to junior bioethicists, and are well-known and well-respected scholars in our field that many of you would know. This advice has been more frequent than I can express to you. However, this advice has always troubled me because it poses a great problem for my research agenda. So to put into context, my primary research focus is on the intersection of structural inequities and social determinants of health and its influence on Black individuals, generally poor health outcomes and experiences with healthcare. To efficiently do this research, however, I have to use both bioethics and humanities values, principles, and research methods. So this advice to make my work distinctly bioethics would make my research project incomplete. On one hand, bioethics gives me the how to do this work. I do this work to bring justice to Black people, a group who have been denied basic human dignity by healthcare for quite some time. Bioethics helps me to theorize what justice for Black people means in the name and in practice. But health humanities gives me the reason why I do this work. Health humanities gives me the insight into human nature, into what it means to live a life of well-being, to theorize different perspectives of what it means to be healthy and live a life with dignity, and what all of this means for Black Americans. Health humanities also gives me examples of how inequities and social determinants of health affect individual lives and how it continues to affect generations of Black people. Bioethics gives me the tools to help students see this problem, especially at a population level, but health humanities gives me the tools to show my medical students why this problem matters, why this problem is unjust, and specifically at the community level. This point is that to be a good researcher and a professor of Black people's health, I have to use both bioethics and humanities. And as a scholar, whether that be junior or senior, that should be the ultimate goal. But the advice to make my work distinctly bioethics prioritizes human ego over research. To tell me to make my work distinctly bioethics is just another way to say that research into racial justice is not truly bioethics, and that scholars who study these topics are not true bioethicists, but rather they are humanities scholars, and that somehow makes our work less worthy and a study and practice of humanities inferior to bioethics. At one point in time, this type of advice may have been great advice for a bioethicist starting their career. This kind of advice may have been key to securing tenure. However, I suspect that this advice was more appropriate during the genesis of bioethics, when early bioethicists were working to establish bioethics as a professional discipline. But for junior bioethicists like myself, whose research is bioethical in nature and involves social justice issues and issues of race, this very narrow advice stifles our research projects. It's also bad advice for bioethics in general. It keeps bioethics from being a driving force in contemporary social justice issues that affect marginalized populations. In other words, this advice to make our work distinctly bioethics misses the mark. In particular, it ignores our work as bioethical in nature, sure, but also draws in various disciplines and humanities, which makes our academic contributions better. Furthermore, I fear that if bioethics does not embrace humanities in its own right and as a complement to bioethics, then bioethics will only be the handmaiden of medicine and not a proponent of social justice and not an advocate for vulnerable populations, which, based on the principles of bioethics, it is in a unique position to do. For bioethics to provide a suitable backdrop for the kind of social justice work that draws on the humanities that many new bioethicists are doing, as a profession, there has to be a few changes. So for one, ASBH first has to set the example. The ASBH annual meetings, intentionally or unintentionally, send the message that bioethics is its primary concern and the humanities are an afterthought. This can be seen in the topics that are covered by the main sessions, including the plenary sessions. They are overwhelmingly set in traditional bioethics. There are sessions that are humanities in nature. However, those sessions are not as abundant as the bioethics ones. If ASBH were to prioritize presentations, workshops, and plenary sessions that are both bioethics and humanities in nature, that would send a clear message to everyone in bioethics that this is the way of the future. This would set the tone for what it means to practice bioethics at a professional level. This would also make it clear to junior bioethicists that this is what is expected of them to be a professional bioethics, also setting a tone for those committees granting junior scholars promotions. Secondly, as many centers and medical schools like my own are a name called Centers for Humanities and Ethics, teaching, publishing, and service expectations should include expectations that faculty involve themselves in both humanities and bioethics. Center directors must encourage their faculty to center their work in both humanities and bioethics and reward those efforts. It is not that very siloed singular work in bioethics is not important to progressing scholarship as well as one's career, but if we're going to name our centers as Centers for Humanities and Ethics, then it should not be a name only, but also in practice. Lastly, grant-giving institutions that fund bioethics and humanities research ought to fund those projects that actually meet their requirements. For example, grant proposal instructions will often say something like, we are looking for the ways bioethics and humanities intersect to reveal innovative solutions to the world's most pressing issues of health, or something similar to this. We've all seen it. But when the winning projects are released, however, the project abstracts will be overwhelmingly bioethics in nature and will perhaps have a small portion of the research set in humanities. Sometimes there will be no apparent humanities in the topics of the projects at all. If you are a junior scholar, this sends a message that if you want your bioethics research to get funded and to be funded well, humanities should not be an equal partner in your bioethics proposal. And in fact, any significant work in the humanities in your proposal will mean that your proposal will have a less of a chance of being accepted. If this is not what grant-giving institutions and bioethics intend, then the accepted proposals ought to reflect their preferences. But arguably, accepting mostly bioethics proposal does show their preference. Their preferences just don't align with, say, the name of ASBH or the name of our humanities and ethics centers. When the relationship between humanities and bioethics is unclear, and scholars' work and perception of bioethics reflects this lack of clarity, junior scholars are left in a confused limbo state with no clear guidelines on how to succeed in their profession. When the ASBH also does not serve as a source of clarity on this issue, this limbo state is magnified. As the most influential organization in bioethics, ASBH has the perfect opportunity to model what it means to be a bioethicist and a humanities scholar to junior faculty. The annual conferences should model a seamless cooperative marriage between bioethics and humanities for junior faculty. However, in my experience, the annual meetings make it clear that bioethics is a priority and humanities is an afterthought, which again is problematic for scholars like myself whose projects focus on social justice. In closing, the ASBH recently issued a statement on racial injustice and professionalism in bioethics and health humanities. In it, it states that racism and racial injustice stand in direct opposition to the goals of the ASBH. As we know, there are many subtle ways to be racially unjust. One subtle way to be racially unjust is to not have clear standards on what it means to succeed. This is particularly true in the people who are most subjected to these unclear standards are junior faculty of color, because for one, scholars of color are more likely to be junior scholars than senior scholars, and more likely to research social justice topics which lie at the intersection of bioethics and humanities. To be more racially just and to help maintain bioethics' position as a leading field of study suited to aid social progression, ASBH must set an example for us on the relationship between bioethics and humanities and how this relationship should play out in our careers as bioethicists, especially for bioethicists who are hoping to make worthwhile contributions to the profession. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Jay Baruch. I am a professor of emergency medicine at Alpert Medical School at Brown, where I direct the medical humanities and bioethics scholarly concentration. And the title of my short presentation is Getting Messy with Stories. So the drama mythologizing in the media about emergency medicine is only a small part of my practice. Most often, I'm faced with lives stressed by misbehaving bodies, social issues, and feelings of vulnerability, fear, and a loss of control. And I must tend to their less obvious wounds. The practice of caring for ER patients at its core is a practice of caring for their complicated, incomplete, and often messy stories. Catherine Montgomery, in her book, The Doctor's Stories, said, "Clinicians work to perfect the maps of illness, but each patient, each instance of illness is uncharted territory." It echoes the writer Eudora Welty when she describes the writing process as moving stories into open spaces. Characters make choices, and these choices become more complicated, and the stakes amplify. Stories resist mapping onto the reductionist paradigm of medicine, and traditional skills and expertise doesn't prepare healthcare providers for the complexity, instability, and uncertainty of clinical practice. Why tell you this? Despite my scholarly work, I'm first and foremost an ER doc and a writer. My entry point into humanities was medical ethics, and what drew me to medical ethics was the same thing that drew me to emergency medicine, my love for literature, creative writing, and stories. I saw ethical dilemmas in clinical practice as the high point of a story, a profound moment of conflict where characters have different ideas about how to move forward. Story is about trouble. Something has gone awry. That could be our body, our identity, our view of ourselves, our relationship with others, our sense of control, our belief in what counts as a good and a harm. I use the term character with great respect. In stories and in life, people are complex characters who want something badly, but who meet obstacles along the way. A gap emerges between what characters expect to happen and what actually happens. Healthcare lives in that expectation gap. And how people respond to this gap and these pressures reveals something about them. A central problem in medicine is the disconnect between the stories we tell and the stories people experience, and the discomfort we feel sometimes because they don't suggest ready solutions or answers. Most of us weren't trained in discomfort. What do we need to do? The graphic artist and writer Linda Barry wrote, "The thing I call my mind seems to be kind of like a landlord that really doesn't know its tenants." So how do we set out to know our mind's tenants? It begins by being more creative and to emphasize process. Where do we start? I have 3 small suggestions. 1, we need more comfort with not knowing. The type of not knowing described by the writer Donald Barthelme in his essay of the same name. In this essay, he described the writer as someone who, when embarking upon a task, doesn't know what to do. Writing and the creative arts in general is a process of dealing with not knowing. Problems are crucial to not knowing. The seriousness of the artist is defined by the seriousness of the problems he or she takes into account. Without problems and the possibility of moving the mind in unanticipated directions, there would be no invention. The function of narrative, said the cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner, isn't to solve problems, but to find them. Narrative is deeply about plight, about the road rather than the inn to which it leads. Sometimes problem finding is more important than problem solving. The best medicine and the latest technology won't work on the wrong story. 2, we have to value getting stuck. Getting stuck is an opportunity for discovery. Being stuck means you're onto something. It's your mind's tenants telling you to pay attention, to stop, to probe, and to think differently. Whenever I'm stuck while writing, the impulse is to force the plot forward. This often means controlling more than I should, making assumptions, taking shortcuts, or looking for a more convenient story. In these moments, I find stability in these unstable situations, by trying to understand character. The answer to the question of how do I proceed is frequently found in the question, how did we get here? Who are these people? What are their desires? And what stands in their way? 3, we must emphasize how we think, not just what we're thinking. We must map our thinking process when making decisions, starting with the decisions we make before we think we're making decisions. We believe we reason by taking and processing objective pieces of information, but actually we have a tendency to make decisions and jump to them and then focus on information that supports that. We believe we look and then think, but what we think determines what we choose to look at and how we direct our attention. John Berger said, "We only see what we look at. To look is an act of choice." Stories don't emerge whole. They're constructed, made of fragments of information. But do we ever stop to consider why we choose certain pieces of information and not others? Our brain has a way of filling in those gaps, and without our knowledge can lead to medical error. Story is a muddy, often potholed road full of detours. It's a struggle, but a struggle that doctors and all healthcare providers and patients travel together. I work with concrete and granular experiences. A particular person with a particular desire is facing particular troubles. Every story requires its own map, but we can't forget, a map can't be mistaken for the territory it represents. Traveling this territory requires creativity and adaptability, a willingness to extend beyond our comfort zones. The arts and the humanities can help. Anand Kumagai and his colleagues said it best. The role of arts and humanities in health education is to make strange, to disturb and disrupt one's assumptions, perspectives, and ways of acting so that one sees the self and others and the world anew. Thank you very much.
I'm Micah Hester from the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and I'm chair of the Department of Medical Humanities and Bioethics there. I'm honored to be on this panel with these distinguished professionals, and I fear my talking points today will be hardly as erudite and insightful as theirs. In the 65 years since Fletcher's Medicine and Morals and the 50 years since the invention of the American term bioethics itself, we, the academicians who focus on humanities and healthcare, find ourselves separated from our roots and separated from our colleagues in many ways. We are separated from our roots insofar as it can be hard to be taken seriously, say, as a philosopher like myself, once you have become a bioethicist. And we are separated from each other insofar as we struggle to live under the same professional roof, with ever-present calls for division that are at least as persistent as calls for inclusion. But before we fully lament this reality, it's important to acknowledge what good separation brings. First, it has been proven time and again that specialization and narrowed focus produces impressive results. Medicine itself would be much farther behind in its successes regarding the cures of disease, were it still a kind of generalist's pursuit. The same holds true in the humanities, and we'd be foolish to argue otherwise. This doesn't mean that we cannot have generalists that do important work for and in the field. But specialists move everything forward in ways no generalist can. Second, it's important that if we wish to claim that health humanities and not just bioethics offer a unique and necessary critical attention to medicine and science, that we go ahead and acknowledge that bioethics and clinical ethics, well, they've garnered some foothold in medicine and accreditation, while literature, history, spirituality, and so forth simply have not yet. These disciplines need their own attentive measures in ways that bioethics simply does not right now, even if bioethics isn't as fully secure and integrated as we'd like it to be. And yet, rightly acknowledging the good of specialization and focus doesn't hide the fact that separation has troubling consequences as well. For one, it can leave us siloed, alone, confused, and even bitter. Separation can undermine good communication, losing out on opportunities for support. Why, for example, as a philosopher who happens to focus on bioethics, am I not part of health humanities? And if I am, then why do we act like there's bioethics and then there's health humanities? And if we want to argue that we're all one, why does health humanities not get better champions, say, to college and medical center leadership by ethicists who typically lead programs? For example, why are they, the health humanities, not part of accreditation requirements? Further, and most troubling, separation can foster conflict between and among us. Fighting for limited pots of money, fighting for space on professional conference programs, fighting for status. If we are to figure out a way to retain the good while mitigating the bad, we will need to be creative, charitable, and humble. In this light, we should acknowledge a couple of things. One, humanities as an academic pursuit long predates bioethics and health humanities. Two, ethics has a long history of being under the umbrella of humanities. These 2 points matter because they contextualize today's tension. If humanities are old and established, what is this upstart idea of health humanities such that it differs in meaningful ways? If ethics has long been a humanities discipline, why does it seem to run along at its own pace, often without robust acknowledgement of its fellow humanities disciplines in medicine, getting a seat at the table while the others don't even get in the room? To be sure, I fully realize many have worked to answer these questions in very careful ways, and I'm merely pointing this out that there are well-grounded reasons why these questions do and will continue to persist. So within this brave new world we are creating, to attempt resolution begins with an acknowledgement of our shared history, not just our obvious differences. A history that leads to novel pursuits in the realm of healthcare. Further, it requires open communication among the parties at play. It means drawing on and acknowledging insights from each other. The appeal to and use of narrative is an obvious example where connections between bioethics and health humanities have been and still are happening. And there are many other examples as well. In order to work towards stronger, better environments in which bioethics and health humanities are well related and complementary, able to hold their own spaces while reinvigorating their deep connections, we need to acknowledge some practical issues too. Issues, admittedly, that I will narrowly construe in relationship to the environment of academic medicine and not academia writ large, since it just turns out that I work in a college of medicine at a health sciences university. For one, while pushing to find new and creative funding sources, we simply must learn to live with the fact that funding will always be a challenge. The humanities, bioethics, and the like bring in little to no revenue to the college or the medical center. We may save money, but we do relatively little to make it. There are exceptions, of course, but they're rare, and they have special circumstances that are not always easily generalizable. Also, if you want a full-time job in academic healthcare environment and you have a health humanities degree, don't hold your breath. It can and does happen, but the market is small. For instance, I'm currently trying to hire a full-time tenure-track faculty position, but if you come at me with history and literature as your disciplines, you won't even make the first cut, unless there is a way. Be sure you have achieved reasonable experience with and in medical and healthcare environments and become multifaceted. Look, please do literature, do history, do metaphysics. But your work only applies if you understand the roles and responsibilities, practices, and policies that affect the environment of healthcare and health sciences. Further, put clinical and research ethics in your professional toolbox. Remember, we already acknowledged that ethics has a seat at the table. And one reason for that is that there's funding from the clinical enterprise for ethics consultation, not for literary analysis, not for historical insight. If you can be you and do some ethics, then you have a chance in academic medicine, at least a greater chance. If not, your chances do fall precipitously, and that's not just a loss for you, but it's a loss for us. We need historians, and we need literary theorists, and we need all the insights that humanities can bring to bear. And in so doing, should you become multifaceted, you will also help bring together what is now far too separate in medicine, the worlds of bioethics and health humanities. And I know the rest of the panelists appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you all panelists for these wonderful, insightful, and evocative remarks. We have a number of questions in the Q&A list and an interesting series of threads going through the chat. I think I'd like to start with the first question that came in from Deepak Sarma. Isn't the very designation humanities a product of a Euro-Christian paradigm? If so, then how does thinking about the humanities fit into the current issue of the annual meeting regarding pluralism? Should the ASBH start including non-Euro-Christian paradigms in these conversations, panels, and so on? This panel, for example, does not include anyone thinking outside of these Euro-Christian paradigms. I'm thinking maybe Patrick, would you like to take that question, or anyone actually could jump right in?
Sure, I'll try to make a quick statement on this. So thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, for that question, and one that I would have expected from my friend in that respect. And so I do think that there is a sense in which the base premise driving your question is right-headed. And what this raises for me, anyway, in conversation with this, is the pluralism of pluralisms. Right? I mean, pluralism is so broad, it could be focused in a particular discipline, plurality there, plurality across disciplines, plurality when it comes to political views, conceptual views, so on and so forth, larger world views, geographical spaces from which ideas flow. And so I do think that there is a significant challenge that we have to always be mindful of in spaces like this. And so there are going to be limitations that we have in any particular space, but I think your point nevertheless is very well taken. And what raising this does for us, I think, is puts on the radar screen for us a kind of charity and humility that Dr. Hesta in his presentation was describing and discussing, so that we can be more aware of including more voices that can give us insight and analysis to these very important questions.
Thanks, Patrick. Anyone else on the panel like to respond to that question? Great, let's move on. Another question is, as a physician clearly in bioethics, I don't understand why some areas that are traditionally within the humanities, e.g. philosophy and history, are not considered health humanities. Is health humanities only literature and art? Why aren't philosophers considered health humanities scholars? Who among the panelists would like to respond to that question?
All right, since I'm making a face, I'll go ahead and respond. So I think part of what I don't want to speak for everyone on this panel, but for me, part of what this panel was about is the continual questioning of what we mean by health humanities and what we mean for it to intersect. And this actually goes back to Dr. Sarma's question about what are the paradigms that we're setting up about what is humanities. Something I think about as someone who's grounded in a lot in the performing arts is how humanities is just kind of overwhelms arts. So we don't talk about arts separately, but we know it's there. So there are a lot of ways that the structures we have set up don't work for what we're talking about. And I think that to ask why are they not is the wrong question. And the better question is, how are they part of it? And that's what we would like to get to. And perhaps that's the problem with separating out bioethics and humanities, is to say these are two things, when I think many of us, the world we live in, at least, and I'll stop saying we because I'm representing others, the world I live in is constantly, how are we, where are we connecting? What are we doing together? And so there's like, my argument would be, the question should be, where are philosophers part of the humanities? Where are they doing something else? Why are we calling this the humanities? But as I said in my performance, this is what I do, is I'm not going to give you an answer. I'm going to say we need more questions.
If I can, I'll go ahead and jump in and just say this. I mean, I struggled with this question too, being a philosopher and being on the ethics side of this split, if that's a split at all. I mean, I'm trying to figure out bridging and all that too. And there's a couple of ways to look at it. First is that I think traditionally, to whatever degree, humanities is a thing with a history and a tradition. Philosophy and ethics are under that umbrella. And I think the issue is we're learning that health humanities may be a new kind of paradigm of both discipline and umbrella, right? Because you can get a degree in medical humanities or health humanities, but you can also talk about it as if it's an umbrella over a great many disciplines. And I struggled with that for a long time, and maybe that's the new paradigm here that it's creating in some respect, that it's both, and as both may in fact include under that umbrella different ways of thinking about all of these issues, and frankly may at times, for political reasons, be construed too narrowly. And what we need to do is kind of fight through those politics to maybe open it back up, right? And part of my presentation is the idea that somehow we have to figure out how to see this tent, this umbrella, as much more inclusive, without getting so watered down that we're not nothing, or that we are nothing, whatever, right? That we've lost something that we can call what we do, right? But we're kind of all doing it in special ways. So.
Great, thanks, Gretchen and Micah. I think too that speaks to a comment that Jay raised actually in the chat, and he asked specifically, what if you had a space that bridges humanities and bioethics? What would that be, and what would that space look like? Jay, do you want to elaborate on that question, or have you formulated any thoughts? And then we can open it up to others for their comments.
Yeah, I think the question is, have I formulated any coherent thoughts? So I have thoughts, but you know, I think about this a lot, because even within health humanities, you know, I think there's a lot of debate and contentious and well-meaning debate about, like, who are we, and like what is our expertise, what falls underneath this umbrella or this category. And I have to say that, you know, for someone like myself, who I think, because I'm primarily an academic, and I consider myself, I sort of have a badge in both, but not really a real badge, but less of a play badge. I find that I gravitate to the spaces in between, and it responds, and it's a reaction to particular needs that I face. And I just wonder, like, right now, the central question of my work is, how do we create meaningful spaces for authentic engagement with really no attention to what rubric or what paradigm it falls under? Because it matters to us, but I think for the people who we're actually having conversations with, it might matter less. So in what ways do our particular ways of looking limit our abilities to actually think differently? And I feel that there is a different space. I think that it's I'm not thinking about humanities and bioethics. I'm thinking about what do I need to learn from designers, in how I think. How do I need to learn? What do I need to learn from engineers that can help me in my own thinking about the challenges that I'm facing? And I think we all face those challenges as educators. Like, what are some of the central challenges, and who else should be in the room? It's not humanities or bioethics, but who else? Like, who else should be here? And then what do we call that space? And I think the space is important because, sadly or not, we probably need to give that space a name for funding. Junior scholars might need to have a name for that space, but I don't have a name for that space yet.
Can I jump in?
Please do.
Yeah, I think so. One thing I've been thinking about, having come back to the ASBH after being years away, and seeing it in many ways a much more diverse community than I saw the last time I attended an ASBH conference. I still think there's a lot of work to be done in an organization like this. First of all, for bioethics to really recognize the value of the work being done by people, for example, on this panel, to really challenge the systems and structures of power and to address issues of inequality and justice. And this has to start at home. This has to start at the conference. And where people really have to think about the ways in which, even just in the dynamics of some of the individual panels that I attended yesterday, certain modes of presentation and knowledge were legitimized and others were delegitimized, as, for example, performance. And Gretchen's performance was absolutely speaking to this, to the ways in which even someone who's an associate professor in an institution has to continually deal with being considered illegitimate, that her power is always in some ways like surreptitious, that she's working through humor and rumor and these sort of underground modalities of change and transformation. And that's really important and powerful, but it's not the way it should be. We should be looking at the structure of an institution like this, and like, in what way is representation playing out? We really need to re-examine at a systemic level how inequality is being perpetuated throughout the institution and throughout this kind of, even the conference, the way it's structured. So I think it's going to be an interpersonal thing, but also it needs to be a real structural shakeup in order for there to ever be, like Keisha Ray, Dr. Ray's contribution is so critical here, to see the ways in which people's careers are really dependent on, performing in certain ways that are not true to their philosophies, to their deepest ethics. And we're always going to be doing back bends and back flips to try to make it into some sort of sustaining career and relationship with people in our community and our students, without significant structural change happening right now. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I really do think there sort of needs to be global review of this institution.
Thanks, Rebecca. I want to shift gears just a little bit and go to a question posed by Bernice Hausman. I'd like to challenge Micah Hester's pronouncements about how the budget affects humanities and medicine. Those of us who are in and our lead departments can make arguments about the contributions we make to the institution through teaching and also service that provides significant value. To simply accept the transactional model of fee-for-service, parentheses, get grants to pay for yourself, parentheses, is short-sighted in my view. Micah? Micah?
Okay, well, here's what I would say. I agree.
but it also, it's also the world in which I happen to live. And I know, Dr. Hausman, there's a sense in which part of that world is the world in which you live at Penn State. I don't disagree. I make those arguments every time I work on budgets or think about trying to expand our field or anything like that. I absolutely do. But 80% of my capital budget at my university, not my college, my university, 80% of it is paid by clinical revenue. And as such, I have to some degree, understand the game I'm playing, especially if I'm going to try to work on changing the rules of it. So while I always make the arguments about the value of what we bring to the table that is outside the clinical endeavor, my point is the more prepared I and my faculty and staff are to be able to work within some of the parameters that currently exist, I will be more successful at building my department, making my voice heard, and then having the kinds of effects that you're speaking to over time. That's at least been my take on it. And being in, the other organization, the Association of Bioethic Program Directors, that is some of our discussion. I'm not saying we are all in 100% agreement. I mean, again, you're part of this, as is Dr. Case and others. But I mean, I think it's a reality. I don't think I want to say I'm just accepting it as is. I think I want to say that I understand that it's something I have to work within in order to make changes to. So that's my position.
I'd like to pose a question to the group. There was a question that came in on the Q&A, starting specifically for Gretchen, that you mentioned the difference between medical humanities and health humanities. And there was a request for you to explain the difference. So I'd like you to start there. But these issues of naming and framing relate to many of the things that have been coming through in the chat, right? Regarding funding, authority, power, and who gets to speak. And I'd like to ask all the panelists to think about the best practical strategies for ASBH moving forward. Dr. Ray mentioned several of these at the end of her talk, but I'd love to hear more of those from this excellent group of scholars.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. So I guess moving forward, thinking about medical humanities and health humanities, I think one, we have to not be afraid of these different areas. I think it's okay to have health humanities and medical humanities. I think sometimes people in medical humanities think that it focuses too much on medicine and not enough on the entire the entirety of health and the entirety of well-being. But I think it's okay to have health humanities be separate from medical humanities, in the same way as a colleague who talks about dental humanities. And I think it's okay to think about these separate fields and how they can sort of be similar, but then at the same time, I think that's part of going forward and having this bridge between humanities and ethics, is to be okay with these separate areas, but have some unifying factor and have this bridge built. But the bridge has to be inclusivity. It has to be a welcoming of topics. It has to be an inclusiveness of who is studying those topics, and not, these backhanded attempts to make people who study certain areas illegitimate. There was a question in the chat about being a stakeholder in the field that you study. If you're Black and you study Black health, or if you're transgender and you study transgender health, somehow we make those illegitimate ways to study health humanities, medical humanities, or bioethics. And I think that part of this movement going forward, again, this acceptance of these different areas, but then also setting examples, like let ASBH be the way moving forward, but have more voices, have a variety of people on these committees who are saying this is how we can bridge these gaps and move forward. And I think that's partly what we're missing and what we would need to go forward to truly say this is a society for bioethicists and humanities scholars.
I'd like to jump in on Keisha's clarion call. So eloquently said. So I think there's there's two dimensions to moving forward. I think one is this notion of you have to become more of an inclusive organization and a more open organization, and not only in the ways that Keisha just mentioned, but also letting it be known that we're open to a diversity of, not just a diversity of participants, but a diversity of types of content. Like what counts as scholarly content is very different now. It's not just papers. I mean, it is visual. It is stuff that is on the web. It is, I mean, we have this technology now, and we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of scholarship. The notion of scholarship has changed, and we have to recognize that this has changed. There are people doing incredible work in non-traditional ways. Second, and what I learned from my time on the board is that, you know, oftentimes there were not a lot of people sending in humanities papers or humanities presentations. So it's like a chicken and egg thing. We both have to like make certain the organization is open. We have to get the word out that the organization is open to many different types of content. And then we in the humanities, or whatever that is, have a responsibility to actually submit, you know, and submit proposals. And as faculty, as senior faculty, and we have to encourage our junior faculty to take chances and to send it to organizations like ASBH. So I think there's two like practical matters I think that needs to be addressed to make it a more diverse and I think a more robust meeting.
But again, just quickly add to what Jay's saying, if we submit, we have to know that it'll be worthwhile, that ASBH will be open to those submissions, right? It can't be just submit and then nothing happens, because as we all know, your CV is everything in this field. When you're going up for tenure, that's what you want. So if you submit to ASBH over and over and it's not the kinds of things that get accepted, then you don't have that line in your CV. And then you're a bioethicist and you're going up for tenure, and they're going to say, why haven't you presented at ASBH, right? So it has to be a welcoming of the kinds of topics that junior scholars are doing, particularly those that are in these underrepresented areas. The kind of work that they do is still a little hesitant to be accepted here. So it feels like there needs to be this sort of partnership between centers and universities that are hiring junior faculty, and then ASBH, who is really a gatekeeper of something that they need to advance in their career.
Maybe at the next meeting, we could do a kind of collective interpretive reading of the bylaws of the ASBH and really look at how representation is constructed textually. So what does it take to be able to be a part of leadership? And I know that we have in the past had, you know, these elections where someone from the humanities is run alongside someone from bioethics. And, you know, since humanities is proportionately so small, the representation is so small within the organization, they always lose. Also, just in terms of like, how long does leadership last? Is there really long enough for there to be some sort of institutional memory of like that time that the program committee says, oh yeah, we're going to make sure that humanities is represented going forward, but that it might get forgotten. And just in ways in which other people, like beyond disciplinary differences, marginalized groups and identities and issues are represented not only in affinity groups, but interwoven throughout the organization. I feel like some of that already happens serendipitously when you submit an individual paper and get sorted onto a panel where you're presenting with people from really different backgrounds, but it can be done more deliberately structurally through the way that the ASBH bylaws are written or maybe rewritten.
I wanted to jump in just briefly. This is my first year serving on the program planning committee. And there was a question that came through in the Q&A asking, is there proof that humanities proposals are not being accepted, or is this merely speculation? And I wanted to say that when we put out the special call, for example, for that second call for papers, we received no submissions at all in the arts and humanities category. So while I think there are many critiques of ASBH that we can make that have been really productive here, I also want to put this out as encouragement for everybody to submit widely and broadly. I know we have about 1 minute left. I'm going to turn things back to Joe.
Thanks, Erin, and thank you all for your participation and incredibly insightful comments. I'm speaking to the members of the audience as well as the panelists, and I'd just like to say thank you again. If you have suggestions for bridging these fields, I communicate with ASBH and we'll funnel those into further discussion. So thank you so much. It's been great to see you.